My guest today is Professor Glenn Schwartz, who's Professor of Archaeology and Archaeology Program Director at Johns Hopkins University. He's a Near Eastern archaeologist whose research focuses on the emergence and early history of urban societies in Syria and Mesopotamia. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you, Gill. Nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your very recent paper that got a lot of, I guess, a lot of take, so to speak, which is quite interesting. So you say here non-cuneiform writing at third millennium, El Mara, Syria, evidence of an early alphabetic tradition. You say here in abstract, 4 incised clay cylinders from tomb 4, 24th century BCE, in the early bronze elite mortuary complex. We want to look at that elite part a little bit. Mortuary complex at El Mara, Syria, have symbols evidently deriving from a non-cuneiform writing system. Comparison of the characters on the cylinders with signs from better known non-cuneiform systems such as Egyptian and Harappan yield few convincing parallels. However, correspondences between the symbols on the cylinders and early alphabetic Semitic characters can be noted. If might therefore be hypothesized that the El Mara cylinders represent a very early manifestation of alphabetic writing. So I want to do sort of two definitions first. One is sort of space and time. So you say here 24th century BC. So we're talking about 3000 to 2000 BCE, right? Generally speaking. And we are talking about Mesopotamia, all right? Is that the space location we're talking about?
No, we're not. We're talking about Syria. So Mesopotamia is the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, which primarily occupies what is now Iraq.
Yeah.
So the part of, and my site is in Syria, to the west of Mesopotamia. Not far, it's only, maybe about 30, 40 miles from the Euphrates River. So it's pretty close to Mesopotamia, but it's not in Mesopotamia itself.
Oh, wow. Okay. So parts of Syria is part of Mesopotamia, but not everything, right?
That's right. The northeastern part of the modern country of Syria is in Mesopotamia because it's in between the two rivers, Euphrates and Tigris. But the rest of Syria is not in Mesopotamia.
And so these cylinders that you found are in Syria. So that it's not part of Mesopotamia that where you did the digging.
Correct.
Okay. So the other thing that I want to define is this alphabetic writing. So for general public, so we have two ways to think about writing, right? So there's alphabetic writing, like we do in English, for instance, and then we have sort of phonographic. I don't know what the right term would be. Sort of communication vehicle. So how do you define this alphabetic writing specifically?
Well, alphabetic writing means the use of symbols to represent phonemes. So a phoneme is the shortest sound that you can make. So basically consonants or vowels. That's what we're mainly talking about. So in the English alphabetic system, you know, our letters stand for consonants or vowels, and I forget how many letters there are in English.
26.
26. Okay. Yeah. You know, there are only so many phonemes that a language will have. Usually, I think it's between 20 and 40, something like that. So alphabetic systems use a relatively small number of symbols. But other types of writing systems, that say the earliest that were invented, in fact, they use many other ways to convey speech and language. So a common way was to use a logographic system. That means that one symbol stands for one word.
Yeah.
So when writing was invented for the first time in Mesopotamia and then in Egypt, that's how they used it. So there'd be one symbol that stood for one word, and it could be a word that had a long word, with many phonemes, but it was one symbol for one word. Now, as you can imagine, that could be very cumbersome because you want to use many words when you're writing. So you want to use hundreds of words, thousands of words. And if it's a logographic system, that means that each word has to have its own symbol. So you mean you have to have hundreds of symbols or thousands of symbols. Chinese, I believe, still is logographic, and it does have lots and lots of symbols.
How about Japanese?
I don't know. Well, Japanese, they modified it. I think they refined it, and so there's different versions of it. But I don't know much about Japanese writing, so I shouldn't say. But even the logographic systems like Mesopotamian and Egyptian, they realized pretty soon that only logographic was going to be too burdensome. You had to memorize too many symbols and invent too many symbols. So they started using phonetic values also. So in Mesopotamia, they used phonetic values for syllables. And in Egyptian, they used phonetic values for combinations of consonants. So they were trying to make it easier, but even so, both of those systems were very complex. But an alphabetic system, it makes it very simple. You just need 20 to 40 characters.
Yeah, it's interesting. So with 26 symbols, we can write Shakespeare.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But we couldn't do that with sort of very complex symbols. So this is sort of a simplification of language in some ways, right?
Yes, and sometimes it's referred to as a democratization of writing. Not of language. We have to make an important distinction between language and writing.
Yeah.
So you and I are talking, we're using language, it has nothing to do with writing. Whether we write this down or not, who knows? But yeah, so it was a democratization, one could say, of writing. Because if you only have to learn 20 to 40 symbols, it's a lot easier to learn.
Right.
In theory, it made it easier for a lot more people to learn how to write and read. Of course, alphabetic systems, even in societies that used alphabetic writing systems, it didn't mean that everybody became literate all of a sudden. So, in most societies throughout history, it was only a small percentage of people that did learn how to read and write. But it made it easier to learn how to read and write for those in those societies that use alphabetic systems.
Yeah, so it's a good way to think about it. So democratization of language,
of writing,
because it is now open to the masses, so to speak. Before that, only the elite, so to speak, could do it, right? So
yeah.
So what did you find? What did you find here? I mean, this seems like a groundbreaking thing, Glenn. I mean, we find alphabetic writing 500 years before we thought it actually happened, right?
Yeah, it is groundbreaking. If it's true, I mean, I admit that there's some uncertainty. I am not completely convinced, and I don't claim that it is proven that these are alphabetic characters. But I do think the chances are pretty good. And if it is true, then you're right. It's quite game changing, as one of my colleagues put it.
So you found this in Syria, and if your hypothesis holds true, what we're finding is that, so I can't quite remember. So we thought the Egyptians invented alphabetic writing? Has that been the sort of the conventional view?
Not exactly. The conventional view is that the alphabet was invented by people who spoke a Semitic language,
Hmm.
but in Egypt. So they were, immigrants to Egypt for one reason or another. Maybe they were brought there by force, who knows? But they were in Egypt and they were familiar with the Egyptian writing system. And the Egyptian writing system, it's complicated. So a lot of the symbols are logographic. One symbol stands for one word.
Hmm.
A lot of the symbols are phonetic. So they have, one symbol standing for maybe 2 or 3 consonants.
Hmm.
The Egyptians never wrote vowels, by the way. They only wrote consonants. And then there are some symbols in Egyptian where one symbol stands for one consonant, one
Yeah.
phoneme. So the Egyptian is kind of like there's an alphabetic system embedded inside the Egyptian hieroglyphic system. So
Hmm.
the idea is that some Semitic speakers were familiar with Egyptian writing and were familiar with these symbols that stood for only one phoneme. And they were inspired by this to invent a new system that was only symbols for phonemes. And that was the alphabet.
So the hieroglyph, I mean, I don't know anything about this yet, Glenn. So the hieroglyph, the Egyptian system, um, that was alphabetic writing in some ways, right? So
Part,
um,
oh, only part of it.
only
Just
part of it,
part of
okay,
it.
only part of it. So and that was like 2000 years, 2000 BCE. That's where we think that happened.
Well, Egyptian writing appears by around 3200 BC,
So
but alphabetic Semitic writing appears, the date is actually much debated,
hmm,
but maybe at the earliest around 1900 BC.
1900s, okay. So that's why your discovery is quite an amazing thing. So what you are suggesting here is that alphabetic writing, which is sort of, like a computer in some ways, uh, in the sense that it's a system that is quite different from how I would imagine early Homo sapiens attempted to communicate, because here you're sort of optimizing symbols and you're connecting them into some sort of language that creates quite a quite a difficult, complex, not complex. It's literally simplification of communication in some ways, right?
Yeah, well, so writing in general is a representation of speech, of human
Yeah.
speech. So it's not the language itself that's being simplified, it's the way to communicate it. So rather than communicating through the spoken word, it's communicating through the written word.
Yeah.
And that is revolutionary because that means you can communicate huge amounts of information to all sorts of people far and wide,
Hmm.
as well as to people in the future. I can write something now, and maybe 100 years from now, somebody else will read it.
Hmm.
So you can keep records now that people will refer to in future generations. So that's the amazing thing about writing itself.
Hmm.
Alphabetic writing just makes it a lot easier to communicate via the written word.
Yeah, I don't know if it just, well, it's definitely easier, but it is a step function change, I would argue, without knowing anything about it, in communication, because you substantially reduce the symbols by an order of magnitude,
Mm-hmm.
and then you substantially increase the sort of the breadth of communication possible by combining those symbols, right? So it is, I would argue, potentially the biggest technology since the wheel for Homo sapiens, because once you can do that, you can go places, and that's how we went places, I think.
Well, I would say that's true of writing, and that the alphabet is a way to make writing easier. Yeah, yeah.
And so, can you give some color on so these clay cylinders that you found?
Hmm.
Can you give some color on how you reach these conclusions? I mean, how would we know it's alphabetic writing?
Well, when I found the cylinders, which is 20 years ago, um, I didn't know what to think. They were strange. I'd never seen anything like them before. Um, just the shape, just the kind of object they are is unusual or unique. I don't know of any other examples of
Hmm.
clay cylindrical finger-shaped and finger-sized objects from ancient Syria. I've never seen any. Um, so just the object itself, and they're perforated. So clearly they were on a string. They were being, suspended from a string. Um, and they had symbols on them, as we know. But what were these symbols? So at first I thought, maybe it's just some kind of weird way to communicate with different symbols, but I didn't, what could that be? And there were at least, they're broken, so I don't know how long the sequence of symbols might have been,
Hmm.
but they have at least five. The one that has the most symbols has five. And the others, another one has four, I think, and one has three. And, so, a sequence of five symbols, what could that be?
Hmm.
So I thought, well, could it be writing? But the writing that we know that they were using in Syria around 2400 BC was what's called cuneiform writing. It's a
Hmm.
Mesopotamian type of writing. It's what they used in Mesopotamia, where they wrote on clay tablets, and when the clay was wet, they used a stylus, this pointed reed, object, to make wedge-shaped characters. They're all wedge-shaped or nail-shaped characters.
Hmm.
That's cuneiform. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped in Latin. But the characters on our cylinders were not wedge-shaped. They're not
Hmm.
cuneiform. So I thought, what could they be? So I tried to compare them to other known writing systems. So Egyptian would be an obvious candidate,
Yeah.
because that's the other well-known writing system from the ancient Near East. And there are a few symbols on my cylinders that look like Egyptian characters,
Hmm.
but only maybe two of them. And the other ones don't
Hmm.
have a good match. So that's what led me, and then I even compared them to Indus writing, Harappan writing,
Yeah.
which is from the same period. Of course, the Indus, it's in what's now Pakistan and northwestern India. It's quite a ways from Syria, although that we know that the Indus people were in contact,
Hmm.
were trading with the people in Mesopotamia, so it's not impossible. But there really aren't so many good matches with the Indus writing
Hmm.
either. So that led me to alphabetic writing,
Hmm.
and there were good matches.
Hmm.
That's how that was the trajectory of
Yeah.
my inquiry there.
That's excellent. So alphabetic writing is quite different from what other civilizations have been trying, Egyptian and the Harappan civilizations included. And what you're arguing here is that it actually started a lot earlier than we initially thought, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And it's very difficult to go much further than 5,000 years. So I want to ask you sort of what is your gut feel about, Homo sapiens started, I don't know, a million years ago. Do you think they would have invented this stuff a lot earlier and we don't have any evidence for it?
I doubt it. I doubt it. I think there'd be some kind of evidence one way or another. Writing, when writing is introduced, in most cases, it's in societies that archaeologists call complex societies,
Yeah.
or you could call them urban societies, urban civilizations. So those are societies that have a certain various institutions in common, including urbanism. So they tend to have big cities, and they tend to have large-scale political organizations, which some would call states. And these political organizations, they involve large numbers of people. It's, a ruler. There's usually a ruler at the top, but there are other people, ministers underneath the ruler, and then flunkies, clerks or something, bureaucrats at a lower level. And they're controlling very large populations in the tens of thousands. And those are the kinds of societies where the central authorities are acquiring large quantities of resources. They're accumulating large quantities of resources. And they also are employing large numbers of people. So they need to keep records of all these resources and of all the people whose labor they're controlling. And that's where writing tends to come in. It's a tool, it's an administrative tool of these large-scale institutions. So I wouldn't expect it to appear in smaller scale societies, and certainly not in, Paleolithic societies, which are just small groups of people who are moving from place to place and haven't accumulated many possessions.
Yeah. So record keeping was sort of the force behind it, and record keeping maybe forced them to become more optimized. And optimization here in this context looks like reducing the number of symbols in some ways. And so they got there about 5,000 years ago. And so what do we know how? So this is in Syria, as you say. What was happening in the rest of the civilizations that we know at that point in time, or do we know anything?
We know a lot.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, to the east of Syria, there's Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia had developed its own complex society maybe around 3,500 BC. So I would say it's the earliest urban complex society in the world. And they had big cities and they had city-states. So each large city had its own king who controlled the area around it. And those kings, they often competed with one another. They had wars with one another. And writing, they had, introduced writing. Organized religion was very important. So they had temples, in the center of the city. Often the temples are raised up above the rest of the community so everybody can see them and acknowledge their importance, getting closer to heaven. The whole idea of the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel probably came from that in the Bible. And then in Egypt, you have what you could think of as a nation state. It wasn't a city state. And Egypt was unified. The whole Nile Valley, for hundreds of miles, was under the control of a single political entity that was ruled over by a king. And in later Egyptian history, we can call that king a pharaoh. And the king had a large administration, a big bureaucracy, scribes who were keeping track of everything with written records. And in Syria also is seeing the development of complex society. Syria also had city-states. And there's a city in Syria called Ebla, where archaeologists found a big palace from around the 24th century BC, the same period as my cylinders. And the palace had thousands of written records found in it. The palace was burned by some enemy. And they, in the burning, and in all the debris, the archaeologists found clay tablets that had been written on cuneiform, but written in the local language. It wasn't it was a Mesopotamian writing system, but the local Syrians at Ebla, they adapted to their own language. So that's the sort of thing that's happening at this time.
Yeah, so not all the cities in Mesopotamia was on the south, right? So we want to go into your book, and north was sort of vacant in some ways, the way that I understand it. That's not true.
Weekend, did you say?
So a lot of the Mesopotamian cities were in the south, right? In
Yeah.
the north was a little bit, I don't know. I mean, we didn't have a lot of cities in the North Mesopotamian area, or
No, they
am I
did.
understanding this correctly? Yeah.
No, they did have large cities in the north. They weren't as large as the ones in the south.
Yeah.
Um, for various reasons could be proposed to explain that. But they did have large cities in the north, and they had powerful kingdoms, and they were writing, and they were quite comparable to the
Hmm.
city states in the south. But what happened is that the city states in the south were unified by a single king around 2300 BC, and that king's name was Sargon. And
Yeah.
he came from a territory that's called Akkad. So he's called Sargon of Akkad. And he unified southern Mesopotamia. And
Hmm.
after doing that, and he unified them by force, he defeated all the other kings and conquered their cities.
Hmm.
After having done that, he moved north and campaigned in the north and claims to have conquered many cities in the north. And that's at the same time that Ebla in Syria was burned. And I think it's quite likely that Ebla was burned by Sargon
Hmm.
or one of his allies. That's been proposed. Um, yeah, so that's what happens. The southern Mesopotamia became politically unified, and then therefore much more militarily powerful,
Hmm.
and it subjugated or devastated a lot of the cities in Syria and in northern Mesopotamia.
So Mesopotamia, so sort of a region. So eastern Syria and southern Turkey will be part of it,
Right, and northern Iraq.
and northern Iraq. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And where you have been doing a lot of digging, it's the northern part of Mesopotamia. So your book, which is quite extensive, I couldn't read it.
I'm not
uh,
surprised.
but I was looking at this discussion conclusions here. So you say here the study of third millennium El Mara has focused on the life of a large but second-tier community in the period when Syrian complex society first formed. Despite our initial interest in such issues as staple or wealth finance, the serendipitous discovery of a complex of monumental tombs on the site Acropolis inspired a focus on the role of ritual, religion, and elite ideology in the formation of societal complexity in Elmara. So, from what I understand, Glenn, I have actually no clue. Um, so where you were doing some of the explorations, it seems like it's sort of organized. Um, there's some elite component to it where people get buried. There's administrative buildings. There is residential buildings. So this is a city that appears to be pretty well organized, right?
Yeah, but so it's the largest community in its region. So I think of it as a city, but it's small compared to the big
Yeah.
powers, the big cities. So Ebla, I mentioned, Ebla is like 3 times the size of El Mara. So I think that's why I call it second tier. I think it was a center, but it wasn't as rich or powerful as the big guys. I like to think of so I like to think of Ebla as the New York of ancient Syria, and Mara is like the Baltimore of ancient Syria.
Oh, Connecticut.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but Mara is unusual
Hmm.
because in the middle of the site and on a high point, there's a kind of a hill in the middle of the site, and on that hill, they built a sequence of mausoleums that I interpret as having belonged to the local elite. And that those mausoleums, they dominate, they would have dominated the landscape of the city. So instead of having, say, a temple in the middle or a palace, they have these tombs that dominated the landscape.
And so I want to get a better feel for this Bronze Age thing. And so you talk about early Bronze Age and middle Bronze Age and late Bronze Age. So we're talking about, so early Bronze Age is like 3000 BCE?
Yeah, 3000 to 2000.
3000, 2000, and middle is like 2000 to 2500 or something?
You have to go in the other direction, 2000 to 1600.
2000, 1600, and then the late is 1600 to 0, so to speak.
No,
Okay.
no, 1600 to 1200.
1200, okay. And so, so bronze requires copper and some tin.
Right.
And how did this happen in the Mesopotamia? I mean, I didn't think they had a lot of copper, right? Did they?
No, there isn't much copper in Syria or Mesopotamia. The copper would have come from what's now Turkey, so
Yeah.
Anatolia, or from Iran, perhaps. Most likely, well, yeah. Yeah, the mountainous regions, the highland regions that form an arc around. So Mesopotamia and Syria are lowland, and as is, well, anyway. And then this arc of mountains around them, it has all these resources. It has lots of raw materials, metals, copper, silver, iron when they start using iron. Also, they're forested, so they have lots of timber, and they have stone, different kinds of stone. The lowlands were relatively poor in terms of raw materials. So yeah, they had to get their metal and stone and a lot of their timber from the highlands.
From the highlands, and they were shipping back pottery or something like that. That was a trade.
Well, that's the question. What were they giving in exchange? What did the people of the lowlands have in exchange for the metals? A common suggestion is textiles. So the people in the lowlands, they had huge herds of sheep and goat, and they were producing wool garments and wool textiles in great numbers. And probably they produced very beautiful, very finely crafted clothing and rugs, perhaps, and other kinds of textiles. And that's, that's a common suggestion about what they were exchanging and what they had to offer to the highland people.
Is there any evidence for sort of long distance trade, like, from the Indus Valley civilization or anything like that?
Oh yes, a lot of it, all over West Asia. Yes. Because the Mesopotamia, the urban societies in Mesopotamia and Syria, they needed these raw materials and they had to get it from far away. So yes, there was all sorts of trade going on. Sometimes there's reference to it in the written texts, and sometimes you can just tell because of the objects that you find archaeologically. So for instance, in my tombs, sometimes you find objects of lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli, the blue stone, beautiful, beautiful blue stone. The only source of lapis lazuli in Western Asia is from the eastern tip of Afghanistan, a place called Badakhshan. So we know that the lapis lazuli that you find in Syria or Mesopotamia came from hundreds, thousands of miles away in eastern Afghanistan. So there must have been long distance trade over quite long distances to get it.
And I guess the kings didn't had sufficient insight into not imposing tariffs on trade.
Sometimes they did. Sometimes they did. Oh yeah.
And so you say here The early Bronze Age occupation of Mara is datable, so 2600 2150, coincident with Syria's second urban evolution. In this period, large cities, that is, Ebla, Nagar, and Mari, appeared, each the center of a political entity of considerable power and influence, but smaller centers, towns, and villages proliferated around them. So at 20 hectares doesn't sound very big in the modern context, but at 20 hectares, El Mara might be understood as a small regional center. Okay, so it's a small regional center. If it was the site of an ancient dub, El Mara would have been the capital of a small kingdom in Ebla's sphere of influence. So you needed a god, and then you needed a king to make a kingdom, right?
You already had gods. Gods were there in profusion.
Yes.
That was no problem. But yes, you need a king to have a kingdom. That's true. And the kings usually worked in tandem with the gods. The kings presented themselves as very pious servants of the gods, and they also claimed to have the special favor of the gods.
Yeah, so when you take this research, Glenn, so it seems like alphabetic writing started a lot earlier than we initially thought. But we cannot go any further back from that, right? So are we comfortable that's where it started, or should we dig, so to speak, further down?
I think it's enough of a stretch for many of my colleagues to think that it started at 2400 than to propose that it was even older. We would need a lot more evidence. But I don't think, like I was saying before, writing usually emerges together with large-scale, complex, hierarchical societies.
Yeah.
And in Syria, those types of societies only appear around 2600 BC.
Yeah.
So the cylinders, if I'm right, date to around 2400. So, maybe alphabetic writing might have emerged slightly before that, but probably not much before.
I saw a documentary. I think it's about El Mara. So when you dig deeper there, you don't find the walls that sort of covers the city, but you can use a magnetometer to sort of look at the expansion of the city.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? It is sort of an architectural or a technological issue?
No, I mean, if the magnetometry is a method of trying to see what architecture is below the surface,
Yeah.
the modern surface of an archaeological site. So it can show you, if it works well, it can show you the outline of walls, but the highest walls, the latest. But in archaeological sites, the lower down you go, the earlier in time you get, right? So, but the magnetometer can only see the uppermost remains.
One
so
layer.
It's showing you the latest occupation, the latest architecture, if it works well. Sometimes it just doesn't work. If you're lucky, it's showing you the walls that belong to the latest period of occupation at the site. But if you excavate, then surely you'll be able to identify them, hopefully.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So many of the cities, ancient cities, are bought in layers or built in layers, I should say. And we cannot see the layers underneath, right? So we can only see what we can see. And that sort of constrains what we could know about the cities, right? In some ways.
Yeah. I mean, before you excavate, the only way to know what's underneath is through techniques like magnetometry. But another technique usually these ancient sites have materials on the surface that come from down below through various means. You know, like sometimes there could be you know, most of the time in Syria or Mesopotamia, there are broken pieces of pottery on the
Yeah.
surface of the site, and the pottery which originates in the site itself. So if you look what's on the surface of the site, you can see what kind of pottery is on the surface and what periods does it come from.
Mm.
And so if you, that gives you an inkling into which periods the site was occupied without having to dig into it. So if you find pottery from the early Bronze Age and also the Middle Bronze Age and also the Late Bronze Age and maybe from the period of the Roman Empire, all on the surface, that can give you a hint as to which periods the site was occupied down below.
Mm. So can we take your cylinders and take those graphics, and can we deploy some artificial intelligence on it, in some ways, to look at all the written languages around the world to see how it could have spread? I mean, I'm looking for some sort of an origination point, you know.
I don't know. I mean, if all the ancient written documents that we have were somehow fed into a database that AI could analyze, then that you could do something like that. You could ask it, I guess, find the symbols that look the most like the ones on the cylinder from all known written languages
Yeah.
and scripts. That would be fun to do, but I don't think we can do it yet.
We don't have enough data, I guess.
Well, we
But
don't have
then,
the data has to be entered into some database.
yeah. But you have a site or a location, where we could go back and get more data on. You have like four samples, four cylinders from that site.
Yes, we only found 4. That's right.
Four. Yeah. I mean, if you go back, could we find more, you think?
It's possible. I think, well, we excavated 10 tombs from this mortuary complex. And it's, I think we probably excavated most of it.
Mm.
It's not, there might be 1 or 2 more. But, and that would be good, but I don't know if there are. And if there were, another problem is many of these tombs were plundered.
Yeah.
You know, because there were elite tombs and they probably all had objects of gold and silver and so forth, which of course is a tempting target for robbers in ancient times as well as modern times. So even if we excavated more tombs, I don't know if they would be you know, if they had been robbed or not. And if they had been robbed, then the chances of finding more cylinders would not be that good. If they were undisturbed, then there would be a better chance.
Yeah. So I want to explore a little bit about this elite aspect of this. So if I remember correctly, Glenn, there were a lot of sort of high class people buried there. Is that true?
So, yes, that's what we think.
Okay. And so what's your conjecture that we find this sort of elite, high class people buried in a small space?
What's my conjecture?
Yeah, I mean, it seems sort of weird, right? I mean, well, it's not weird. Maybe this was a sort of special spot where the big guys were buried. Is that
Yeah,
the way to think about it?
that's what I think. And also, one has to take account of the fact that we've never found any adult burials of adults on the site except for this elite mortuary complex.
Okay.
So I think most people were not buried in the city, but were buried in cemeteries outside
I
the
see.
city. So,
Yeah.
but these people were special. They were buried in the city and in the middle of the city and in these impressive mausoleums.
Yeah.
So I think, and of course, they were buried with costly materials, gold, silver, lapis lazuli. So I think it's pretty likely that they were members of the elite and probably the ruling family, ruling families of the community. So I
And I
sometimes
saw,
call them royal tombs.
yeah, and I saw something, I don't know if this is here or somewhere else. I saw something where all their it's like bodyguards and everybody else sort of buried around them. Is that true?
Yes, there are uh, situations where that is attested. Um, in at Mara, that isn't obvious, except there was one case where we were thinking that might be possible in the beginning. The first tomb that we excavated, it had two young women, each with a baby, buried side by side, and with a lot of fancy jewelry, gold and silver, lapis, beautiful jewelry. And underneath them were two men who had very few objects.
Oh, okay.
So in the beginning, we were thinking maybe this was a sacrificial interment, that maybe the women were high-ranking people and the men were maybe servants or soldiers, buried to protect them or serve them in the afterlife. But when we started excavating more tombs, we realized that in general, the women were buried with more finery and the men were more simple. So I think it was just a difference in the way that the genders were treated in death.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Glenn. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
My pleasure.
Thank you.